Hello, and thank you for joining us. Today, we will be speaking with Dr. Thomas Jeffrey Miley. Dr. Miley is a lecturer in political sociology at the University of Cambridge, where his work focuses on comparative nationalisms and self-determination struggles and the crises of contemporary capitalism. Originally from the United States, he spent years working in and writing on Spain, including on the Basque and Catalan national questions and the legacy of Franquism. In recent years, he has been involved with social movements in Africa, including working together on the ground with the Mathare Social Justice Centre in Nairobi, and with the Kurdish movement, participating in delegations to Rojava, and with the International Peace Delegation to Imrali. He is the author of numerous works on the Kurdish movement, and co-editor of Your Freedom and Mine, Abdullah Ocalan, and the Kurdish Question in Erdogan's Turkey, alongside Dr. Federico Venturini. He serves on the board of the EU-Turkey Civic Commission and is a patron of and close collaborator with the Peace in Kurdistan campaign. Jeff, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor.
The honor is mine. First, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about your background, specifically your upbringing in the United States and the experiences you had in Spain, and how you became involved in politics, and specifically how and why you came to be involved with the Kurdish movement.
Oh, big question. So I grew up in Southern California, suburban Los Angeles, which is a bit of a cultural difficult place in many ways. I don't know. You probably know. You're from California yourself. I grew up in a Catholic family. Went to Catholic school, and so I think really my first approximation to critical ideas were through kind of ideas on the Catholic left that I was introduced to in high school in particular, already in primary school a little bit, but very much so in high school. I had a couple of left-wing Catholic teachers who were, I remember learning about Cesar Chavez in this ethics class that I took in my junior year in high school, reading Alistair McIntyre, communitarian, kind of left communitarian critique of materialism and of capitalism, which when by the time I got to college.
So these were people influenced by the liberation theology tradition, or?
Yeah. I wouldn't say the majority of the people in the Catholic Church that I studied with were influenced by liberation theology, but there was enough there for me to pick up on and make a critique, sort of formulate a critique of. It originated as a critique of materialism in California culture, and then sort of blossomed quite easily into, when I was familiarized with Marxism at UCLA, into a broader critique of capitalism, which was incipient in some of the stuff that I was already paying attention to in high school. So with respect to, a sense of belonging to a community of people that was somehow in opposition to the dominant materialist values was something that then developed in different directions as I got older. My parents had converted to Catholicism, and they were very idealistic. They were part of this movement, this marriage encounter movement in particular, and they were a bunch of young couples that were really very interested in sort of engaging with the Catholic community, and so I grew up with very much with that, and like I say, that developed later. So that's really where my political beliefs were first formed on the Catholic left, or with familiarity on the Catholic left, and I got involved in college then with, in particular, working. The first kind of political campaign I worked on was for Ralph Nader was trying to get universal health care on a referendum ballot in California. That was probably in 1990, I want to say 1991, 1992, when the 92 election, I think it was, that was gonna be on the ballot. So and there is where I came into closer contact with more secular activists on the left. And I remember in particular there was an African American guy who threatened me. He told me that if he found out that I became a corporate lawyer, he was going to hunt me down. And so he said, "You're too." We were doing all this stuff trying to raise money to get this initiative on the ballot. And he said, "You're too good. You're too articulate. It's dangerous. People like you are dangerous." So
you still got this hanging over your head here to make sure you stay to the grindstone.
That was a decisive intervention in a way. When I was a junior in college, I spent a year in Barcelona in Spain, and that was a really transformative year in my life. And that's how I got interested in the whole Spanish question, the Catalan question, the Basque question. I ended up living some 8 years in Spain. When I finished my undergraduate education, I moved back to Spain. I taught English there for a while. I was very just enamored by the urban life in Barcelona. Having grown up in Southern California, to experience a kind of city in the sense of that Barcelona as a city was just something that was fascinating for me. So I ended up spending over the course, because I did my dissertation on politics, Catalan politics, nationalist politics more generally, but with the focus on Catalan politics, language politics, and the national question. And so I did intensive field research there as well. And that allowed me, overall, I ended up living some 8 years in Spain. I had a postdoc in Madrid later. So when I was in Spain, I was always interested in questions of language politics, cultural identity politics, having grown up in California and been very sympathetic to the question of bilingualism in the schools and things like this. And so I was very interested.
It's a big Latin American Spanish-speaking population.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And even with questions having to do with recognition of Ebonics and what language politics with the African American community even was something I was interested in growing up. And so language politics in the European setting was something I was fascinated by, the Catalan efforts to promote the language in the years after the Franco regime and its relationship to aspirations for self-determination, but then also the questions of how those aspirations for self-determination were implicated in class politics in Catalan society, and the way in which, in particular, the linguistic heterogeneity in Catalan society was dealt with by the nationalist movement, and the specter of Spanish nationalism was all something that was fascinating to me. As I was doing my research, I also became more interested in left-wing politics on the ground as well in Spain, and that then became developed into different kinds of contacts with activist communities, and I got to witness the 15M, the Indignado movement, and then got involved in Podemos when Podemos was first starting. Did
you find inspiration in the legacy of the Spanish Revolution, Civil War?
Oh yeah, I mean, I early on in my studies became very interested in. I remember reading Orwell, of course, when I was in my early 20s, and living in Barcelona and just finding it fascinating, and learning all about the anarchist tradition there, which I had come out of at UCLA, was very familiar with a kind of libertarian Marxism that I was introduced to by a guy by the name of Richard Ashcraft, who taught political theory at UCLA, and I was also introduced at UCLA to psychoanalytic Marxism as well. A guy by the name of Victor Wolfenstein, who taught this excellent class on Malcolm X and the Black Revolution, was something that really fascinated me. So I was familiar with different variants of the Marxist tradition, but I was very had a close affinity with kind of more democratic interpretations, radical democratic interpretations of Marx, and was very then interested in learning about the other side of libertarian socialist tradition, which was introduced to first through Orwell, then through Noam Chomsky as well, and then became more and more familiar. It was always a pet project of mine to learn more about the Civil War, and in particular the revolution that accompanied the breakdown of the Republic, the breakdown of the Republic in the 1930s. So yes. But in the contemporary period, although the Indignado movement had interesting inflections that were reminiscent of the anarchist tradition, the anarchist tradition was ruthlessly extirpated from Spain, first by the communist movement, actually, during the war itself, but then crucially as well by the fascist dictatorship. So anyhow, so it was more of a historical interest than it was something that was a living legacy.
Right. And from there, how did you and why did you become involved with the Kurdish movement?
So I ended up, after I got my PhD, I ended up with a postdoc in Madrid at this place called the Center for Political and Constitutional Studies. And I was also teaching at St. Louis University, which is a Jesuit school, which has a campus in Madrid at the time. And I was thinking about staying. I ended up, didn't want to go back to the States, loved living in Spain, and more generally had been my last years in graduate school, I went to Yale for graduate school. And my last years in graduate school were after 9/11, and I really saw the country moving in a very ugly direction, and was happy to live abroad, so to speak, and was planning on trying to figure out a way either to get into the Spanish university or somehow stay teaching at St. Louis University as well. But I ended up finding out about a job at Cambridge, was asked to apply for this job at Cambridge, ended up at Cambridge and teaching political sociology at Cambridge. So one of the great things about teaching at Cambridge, there's lots of horrible things about teaching at Cambridge, but one of the great things about teaching at Cambridge is you get students from all over the world who want to come and study with you. And at the time, my first few years, I was the only political sociologist in the sociology department at Cambridge. So, and I was interested in self-determination movements, obviously, working extensively on the Spanish case, but interested in comparative perspective. I've been trained by an eminent comparativist at Yale by the name of Juan Lintz. Lintz and Stepan had been influences of mine. And so I was very interested in developing a broader comparative perspective. So I began accepting students from all over the world. And a woman by the name of Dilar Dieritz came to study with me and came to study at Cambridge. And I had the fortune of being her supervisor. She first really introduced me. I had been invited to Kurdistan. I'd been to Kurdistan one time before I met Dilar, and that was in 2009, I believe it was, or 2007 even. It was 2007. There was a conference that was in Diyarbakir that had been promoted by the Heinrich Böll Foundation, a German NGO. And it was a moment where they were trying to push for peace process and this sort of thing. And they wanted me to talk about the Basque country and the question of the peace process in the Basque country, and whether or not there were lessons that they could learn for dealing with the Kurdish question in Turkey. So I had some familiarity, but I wasn't familiar with the paradigm shift, the work of Abdullah Ocalan, any of those sorts of things. Dilar very much introduced me to that. And then she also invited me to come to Rojava. And so I was a member of the academic delegation, one of the first academic delegations in December of 2014. That was a delegation that included David Graeber, Janet Beale was on that delegation, a variety of people, a whole host of people, very interesting group of people. So I got to witness the revolution firsthand, which was a really fascinating thing.
It was such an intense moment. I'm sure that was quite an experience.
Yeah, Kobane was still under siege at the time.
Absolutely.
And revolution was something that, I was fascinated with the Spanish Revolution, but it was something that I didn't really imagine ever getting a chance to witness in my life firsthand. So it was a very intense experience, a very interesting thing to witness firsthand. And after that, when I came back as having been a member of the delegation, that's when I came into contact with Estella Schmidt at Peace in Kurdistan. And after that, it was pretty much a done deal, because with Estella, her encouraging me to be involved, to continue involved with to continue working on the Kurdish question, talking about what I'd seen, participating in further delegations. So I ended up participating in the delegation, the Imrali delegations, witnessing the breakdown of the peace process, and really becoming an embedded academic, someone who's sort of embedded in the movement, watching how the movement mobilizes, particularly in Europe, and also doing my part to speak out against the human rights violations, the grave human rights violations, and the struggle for self-determination, the just struggle for self-determination of the Kurdish people.
So, as we've been speaking about, that one of your principal focuses has been on nationalism and comparative nationalisms.
Yeah.
A bit of a general question, but what would you say is the significance of nationalism or the national question on the world stage today?
I think that the national question remains one of the crucial questions and problems that we are facing. We're facing major existential threats to humanity at this point in our existence. Threats coming from the climate catastrophe, which is unfolding, the threats of this ongoing Orwellian war on terror. And the war on terror itself is fueled by very dangerous nationalisms, particularly the American nationalism, the most dangerous nationalism in the world, the one of our country. And more generally, I think the kind of the nationalisms of the old imperialist countries, the nationalisms of the oppressor nations, so to speak, in particular, but more generally as well, kind of nationalist blinders get in the way of being able to address the scale of the problems that we are facing as humanity, and also then becoming the major political obstacle to a humane and rational approach to survival of humanity and the planet. So it's a major issue. There continues to be obviously a belligerent oppression of minority nations. The question of self-determination remains a really important question, even though in the 21st century, the failures of the anti-colonial nationalisms and also point us to a crisis with respect to like what can and must self-determination mean in the 21st century. So nationalism is a huge issue.
And jumping off this issue of what now the vision looks like for the next stage for the 21st century, it seems to me that not only around the world, so much of which has been shaped by the legacy of European or Western imperialism, but even within Europe, and so we have so many unresolved national questions, whether or not there even has been such a thing as a resolved national question, whether it's tied back to the roots of fascism, the development of all kinds of things that bear or loom on our present. And it raises this question of whether or not the order, the nation state, this is a question that Ocalan is asking, this international ordering system is capable of resolving these problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we ultimately have to talk about capitalism and the crises of capitalism, of capitalist modernity, in which the nation state is a fundamental component of the global capitalist order. And so we have to think about the relationship between the nation and the state, and the way in which the nation as an ideology is linked to the legitimation of the state and the problem of the state. So yes,
it's really interlinked throughout all issues. As we were speaking about before, language, there's been this very long debate about the definition of the nation and its relationship to language. It really concerns all fronts.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned also above, you co-edited a book entitled Your Freedom and Mine, Abdullah Ocalan and the Kurdish Question in Erdogan's Turkey. This was published in 2018 by Black Rose Books. Can you tell us a bit about how this book came about, what the aim of the work was, and what you think the significance of this book is?
Yeah, well, I think that the title of the book, Your Freedom and Mine, encapsulates the kind of some of the sentiment, this idea that we want to kind of reformulate what traditional conceptions of solidarity is, where people are helping someone else, and thinking about thinking about the Kurdish movement and implication of the Kurdish movement as being on the forefront of the struggle for freedom in the world. And for a variety of historical reasons, that the Kurdish movement finds itself at the center of geopolitical strife, so much geopolitical strife, and the national question for the Kurds being such being so tragically divided amongst these four nation states, so for a variety of reasons, they find themselves at the center of these conflicts that are unfolding with the crisis of capitalist modernity. And so really thinking about the Kurdish movement and particularly with the rearticulation of self-determination achieved by Abdullah Ocalan, the Kurdish movement really comes to be at the forefront of the struggle for freedom in the world. And so rather than thinking about it as helping them, we have to help each other, because if we go back to the point that I'm making about the existential crisis that humanity faces, this is a key terrain of the struggle for humanity. So involved in these delegations, which were originally spearheaded by Judge Essa Musa.
These are the Imrali delegations, correct?
Imrali delegations, yes. Judge Essa Musa, who had been Nelson Mandela's lawyer, and brought together a delegation of many parliamentarians, academics, intellectuals, activists, to go and to pressure, try to exert some sort of pressure to get the peace process restarted. This was in 2015 with the breakdown of the peace process. From there, the idea of these delegations was born, and after so we would go. So in the delegation, we went on the delegation, met with people in Istanbul, but also in Diyarbakir, and people affiliated with the Kurdish movement to document what was happening as the peace process was breaking down, and try to ultimately we petitioned to see Abdullah Ocalan on Imrali Island, and which was of course negated, but we documented everything we saw. And out of this, and then we went to the European institutions, and we lobbied at the European institutions with respect to the things that we saw. So out of this idea,
this being like the Council of Europe and these kind of places.
Yes, and the CPT as well, the Committee for the Prevention of Torture, and out of this idea of going and participating in this as witnesses and giving testimonial. This idea, we thought that an extension of this form of active solidarity would be to document our reports, document our experiences in the book. And then the book also includes a historical introduction. It also includes contributions from members of the people in the movement itself, and also members of the delegation who talk about their experiences. So that was the idea, to have a kind of a book which was conceived in a democratic and federal vein, and also a book that was contesting the very parameters of solidarity as traditionally confined. So therefore the emblematic name, Your Freedom and Mine.
So that the book is almost like a site for these different people from these different backgrounds and ways of being involved to come and meet each other in a kind of dialogue and do that in one place. So what do you think sorry, go ahead.
And to spread the information about the kind of work that is being done with respect to the international campaigns, in terms of the pressuring on the European institutions, as well as the witnessing and the testimony that can be gained by putting yourself in a space as a delegate of one of these international delegations, so that people think about what the kind of solidarity work is. It's not just a matter of people deciding to go and fight in Rojava. That's not the only option that people have in order to be involved in the Kurdish movement. So,
absolutely.
Which is not to underestimate the importance of people willing to do that as well.
No, absolutely not. Yeah.
Just thinking about the different ways in which solidarity work can be.
Absolutely. And that it takes and that it takes all kinds in all different places. Yeah. Absolutely. So you, as you said before, you have in this most recent period been engaging with the ideas and the writings of Abdullah Ocalan, and you've written a number of works about his ideas. I'm wondering what you make of Ocalan's paradigm, the new paradigm, in particular this state democratic civilization thesis. And maybe, I guess for those who don't know too much, maybe a brief explanation of it, if that's, sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. I mean, I think one of the things that Ocalan does is he formulates a rearticulation of what self-determination can and must mean for the Kurdish movement and more generally in the 21st century. And he does so through really impressive and in many ways inspiring meta-narrative about the history of hierarchy, and the history of the state. And he turns to articulate self-determination as a radical democracy against the state. And so he tells a whole history of the state. And at the same time, he tells a history of the state, which is a history of domination, which is dialectically intertwined with the history of resistance, or history of democratic struggle, so to speak. So there's the state versus democracy as this kind of intertwined in this, what Bookchin calls a double helix of, and Bookchin, of course, was one of the influences in Ocalan's reformulation of self-determination. But this dialectical intertwining between the legacy of domination and the legacy of freedom, so to speak, is something that, and the history of hierarchy, and then putting at the, one of the things that Ocalan does with respect to that history of hierarchy is he puts very crucially the history of patriarchy, the domination of man over woman, as at the inception of so much of this relationship to this story about the state and the history of domination. And he ends up articulating a quite complex and in many respects compelling vision of this struggle for self-determination, understood as a struggle for against patriarchy, a struggle against the nationalisms, and a struggle for some kind of ethnic and linguistic and religious accommodation, and trying to move beyond the struggle for a state to struggle for a democratic civilization, as he calls it, or a democratic nation. At some points, he talks about. And at the same time, he articulates in this articulation is a struggle against the domination of humans over nature. And it's a struggle that then is also associated with the struggle for radical direct democracy, with people's assemblies, citizens' militias, and the like, and which is again a compelling vision. It's not just a compelling vision in the abstract, but it's actually being put into place and being built in Rojava, in the north of Syria, as well as other parts of Kurdistan. But it's really made impressive inroads in the context of the Syrian civil war.
Sure.
So I think it again is something that provides in the context of the Middle East and more generally the alternative to the spiraling of tyranny and chaos in the region, and very much provides an alternative to the capitalist modernity, which is an articulation of self-determination understood as radical democracy against the state, that is at the same time a struggle against patriarchy, a struggle for multicultural, multilinguistic, multi-ethnic accommodation, and a struggle for ecological sustainability.
And as we've even talked about only even some of the dimensions involved in it, it's a very widespread and integrated vision that Öcalan has, both historically and breadth across different dimensions of society. And it certainly requires a lot more depth and investigation than we can get into in this discussion. But it's very striking to me how much emphasis he places on history, and especially very ancient history. It somehow seeks to recover something by investigating origins of things, or seeking to investigate origins. It's I'm wondering what you think of this notion, the sort of this attempt to reimagine and seek.
Well, one of the things that Öcalan says is that of the things that capitalist modernity robs humanity of, it robs its ability to imagine utopian alternatives. And in order to recuperate that imaginative potential for humanity, or the imaginative capacity of humanity. We have to get to the roots of the mentalities of domination and hierarchy. And so he wants to get to the root. And if we think of about the term radical itself, originally means to the root, to get to the root. And so he's trying to get to the root of this very embedded set of mentalities and ideas, to sort of by telling the story and revindicating the story, this alternative story, the story of democratic civilization, and is a way of trying to reignite that struggle and trying to keep that flame alive, and to radically transform the consciousness of people who can come to understand themselves as struggling for freedom, struggling against hierarchy in all of its forms. And so in order to understand and to participate in that struggle, that part of that participation requires the reformulation of our consciousness, the setting free from these deeply rooted mentalities.
To get to the root in order to uproot.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, I think there's, of course, always a danger involved in meta-narratives, which is something that in the academy, there's a lot of skepticism towards meta-narratives of any sort. But I think in this respect, I think the kinds of stories, when you give up the effort to tell orienting story, those stories get told by the right, by the propagandists of capitalist modernity. And so it's a counter narrative, which is a counter meta narrative, which is again attempting to get to the roots of the hierarchical mentalities in order to, I like how you put it, to uproot that and to reinforce and reinvigorate the struggle for democracy and for freedom.
It's there's a couple of ways. I remembered a couple of points. The way he talks about this search through history in a couple of different ways in different places. One point he says in the roots of civilization, he says something along the lines of in order to recover something that you have lost, you must go back to the place in which you have lost it. Which is like a very intuitive notion, but it's powerful in some way too. And he there's another one. It's I'm very bad with quotes, but it's he says something like, history is hidden in our present and we are hidden in the beginning of history. And to me it gets at this issue of the meta narrative that you brought up, because it's absolutely true, the danger involved, that you create a construction, and the question is its correspondence to reality or its efficacy. And the issue is that on one hand, everything is all interwoven and part of a big whole. But on the other hand, whether or not you can create a narrative or a discourse that encapsulates the whole is, I mean, a very ancient problem in many traditions.
I mean, in terms of just to specify what I think are some of the difficulties, some of the difficulty he comes up against is he in particular relies upon a particular kind of historiography. Understandable. He's writing from Imrali prison, and he's only got access to what he can get access to. And in his meta-narrative, what I call a kind of Fertile Crescent-centric meta-narrative, there's very little in the way of discussion about the whole history of Africa, for example.
Very true.
And if we take at the foundations of white supremacy is the obliteration of the African past, there's a way in which Ocalan's meta-narrative reinforces the traditional lack of awareness of the basic reality that the story of humanity begins in Africa.
It's true. I mean, because in the history of white supremacist historiography, there is a tendency to be willing to a certain extent to recuperate the Near East somehow,
Yeah,
but a refusal of Africa. Yeah.
yeah. Well, there's a whitening of Egypt, and then there's
Yeah.
a subordination of Egypt that
Yeah.
happens, and then
Absolutely.
things beyond Egypt are not even really talked about.
Hmm.
So anyhow,
Yeah.
that's just a point with respect to the particular meta narrative that he constructs is a meta
Sure.
narrative that is not that he doesn't construct it as the final word. I think that's a really important
Exactly.
point
I was just
that
gonna
he
say.
makes.
Yeah.
He's definitely in dialogue with
Hmm.
people who are in the first instance thinking about the Kurdish question
Hmm.
and struggling either for or against the Kurdish question.
Hmm.
And so he frames it in a really the way that he frames the history is in many respects subversive and progressive, but in other ways it invites a response from people who are situated differently
Hmm.
with different struggles. And we need to move towards this democratic confederal project is a project that Ocalan has pushed forward in a very valiant and courageous way, but it's not the last word in the project. And I think one of the projects that I'm most proud of having participated in is the initiative's book Building Free Life, which is a bunch of people from all over the world kind of in dialogue with Ocalan.
Hmm.
And I think that being in dialogue with Ocalan is something that is a really important task, given the importance of his attempt to rearticulate self-determination.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's this issue of the spirit of dialogue, the coming together to create something in common. And because, as
Yeah,
you said, it's central that he's very clear that his contributions are A, written in very specific conditions and for a specific context, but B, a first step, a first contribution, just
yeah,
a proposal. And of
that's
course we
right.
could continue talking about this for very long, but
For a long time. Yeah,
yeah.
we have. I
We
mean,
have.
it's great to get to get the chance to talk to you about it in this format. But just for people to know, we did have a relationship that met when I was promoting the book, actually. But
Yeah.
then it turned into a relationship. You came to Cambridge and got a MPhil where you wrote a brilliant MPhil on Ocalan's political thought and its relationship to the political practice of the Kurdish freedom movement. So we've been talking about these issues for at length for a couple of years now, and we'll continue, I'm sure.
Hopefully, yeah.
So
Just the
just
beginning.
for transparency's sake, that it's not like it's not like a conversation that's beginning between us,
It dropped out of the
nor
sky.
is it nor is it an interview between strangers.
That's true. These are important points for context. You were
Yeah,
correct.
yeah,
But moving on for the moment.
yeah, yeah.
I'd like to
Did I
ask you about.
embarrass you? I embarrassed you
No, you have
by
to try
pointing
harder
that
than
out.
that.
Yeah, good.
um, I'd like to ask you about the so-called Western left.
Yeah,
What do you make of this? To say the state of the left in general in the West is quite a large question, but particularly the intellectuals that are somehow that play prominent roles, or the intelligentsia of the left in the contemporary West or global North. And what would you say is
yeah.
the status of political and cultural consciousness in the West today, in those
Political and cultural.
consciousness in
Okay.
relation to this question of the intelligentsia?
Well, with respect to the intelligentsia, I think that there's a major issue and problem has to do with the incorporation of the intellectuals into the academic sphere,
Mhm.
so that you have people who are largely spend most of their time worried about their bourgeois careers, and there's a specialization that has occurred, but there's a professionalization that has occurred, which is associated with a depoliticization um, And
And the
that's one.
financialization of the academy, funding
Yeah,
restrictions, all that stuff. Yeah.
yeah. So there's the crisis of the academy, but there's the
Hmm.
incorporation of the intellectual into this
Hmm.
role of the academic, which is something that I've struggled with, trying to keep a foot in the world of activism, and but also trying to struggle for a more democratic university and come up with difficulties in that. But anyhow, so that's one element of the problem. Then there's a broader issue having to do with, let's say, the activist left. And I think if I focus on the activist left in the United States or in the United Kingdom or in Spain, which are the three so-called Western countries that I have lived in for the longest and have the most experience with. Let me begin with Spain, where there was this really inspiring moment, which was the moment of the Indignado movement back in 2011 originally, and it was in many respects very it was a very exciting time because people were mobilizing for demands for some other kind of instantiation of what democracy could be. But it quickly got pulled into this project, which was the project of Podemos, which itself began as, in an interesting way, where they were building these circles of popular assemblies and things like this, but then it became very much built into an idea of conquering some sort of power in the state.
Like a parliamentary
Similarly,
approach.
Yeah, it became a parliamentary project and re-edited or revisited so many of the problems of that kind of parliamentary left politics. Similarly, we can see in the United States and the United Kingdom, where so much of the energy on the left gets used in order to mobilize in accordance with electoral cycles, be it for Bernie Sanders in the United States or the Corbynite, all the aspirations and all of the effort and energy built into the Corbynite project, where I think that the main project, and here I think that the Kurdish movement is again at the forefront of really conceptualizing what we need to be thinking about doing, which is mobilizing for radical democracy against the state, a radical democracy, a kind of self-determination, which is built at the grassroots, that is somehow self-determining and not expecting that coming to power, seizing power in the state, and kind of re-equilibrating towards social democracy, or some kind of reinvention of social democracy, which I think is a utopian project in the bad sense of the term, given the stage of the capitalist crisis we're at. And it also crucially reinforces the nationalism problem, so that if you look at this, if you look at in particular the Sanders campaign, but also if you look at the Corbynite movement, when it comes to the questions of the political significance of the United States military power or the NATO power in the world, you see in this mobilization, this progressive mobilization, you see very little even being said about that. And I think that has to do with having a politics which is focused around the electoral cycle and coming to power at the level of the nation state. I think we need to be organizing for radical democracy at the grassroots local level, and we need to be thinking about ways in which we can be forging international links between democratically confederalist or to use the Bookchinite terminology, libertarian municipalist radical democratic agendas. And I think that's incipient, and there has been some movement in the United States. There's been some movement in that direction. There's been some of that kind of stuff in other places as well. But nonetheless, I still think that the activist left remains very much wedded to a vision of what politics is, which conflates politics with statecraft, to use again a Bookchinite formulation.
Yeah, absolutely. It is one of these very large pressing questions that has to be addressed through a dialogue of people involved, is what you came to in this last point, how to formulate an approach to politics beyond seeking representation or power within the state. And I think that, as movements must be sensitive to conditions, the conditions of places like the United States, United Kingdom, are very different from those in Kurdistan.
Yeah, certainly.
And formulating an approach of how to do that, and how to create institutions that are able to have the kind of ability to intervene into situations or to affect material life and conditions in times such as ours, is a very large question, very difficult question.
I mean, the way that I have operated myself, I think that one of the things that we can do, those of us who are citizens of the United States, those of us who are citizens of the European Union, is we can try to mobilize to have some sort of at least voice of dissent against the war machine that is dominating the capitalist machine and the war machine that are dominating and destroying so much of the planet. So when I was in Rojava, one of the things that I would ask the people, so, well, what are the kinds of things you would like us to do when we go back? And they said, well, try to stop your government from doing the kinds of things that your government is doing, which is leading to this permanent, this situation of permanent war in where we're at. So I think that there is a strategic location associated with the the possession of citizenship rights in the belly of the beast. But I think that the places where democratic and federal self-determination projects are more likely to gain traction are places where the majority of conditions for the majority of the world, in fact. So, for example, I spent time, as you mentioned, in the ghettos of Nairobi, working alongside really powerful social activists, mobilizing the Mathare Social Justice Centre, for example, and the kind of work that they're doing. I think that the conditions there are very propitious for trying to mobilize some kind of grassroots self-determination project. And then the question is, what we can do is, as outsiders, is maybe help forge the connections between the different movements that are mobilizing at the grassroots, and then again trying to mobilize to lobby to the extent that we can lobby to dismantle from within the machines of domination, both in its war making and its capitalist profit-seeking modality.
Absolutely. I mean, as you mentioned, the primary forces that are over-determining the global situation of finance and of the war machine or just military might are global. And since World War II in particular, the center of power has resided primarily in the US, along with this global alliance of powers. And this issue leads into this final question I would like to ask you about, which is about self-determination, which is about something that we've discussed quite a bit already. But in this period where the forces, where self-determination, often usually understood as of a people and usually associated with the nation, but in a time when more so than ever before, the forces determining the situation are global in scale and scope, what you think the role or the issue for self-determination is today, this issue of reimagining or recuperating self-determination for in the 21st century context, and secondly, how you think your work with Peace in Kurdistan, the Kurdish movement, how they relate to this issue at this global level.
Yeah, well, I think that the important rearticulation of self-determination by Öcalan has been the delinking of the aspiration for self-determination from the aspiration for a nation state. Associated with, in many respects, it's not a contingency that the Kurdish movement, which is at the crossroads, literally at the crossroads of these geopolitical borders, so to speak, and split by these geopolitical borders, never gets its moment of independent nation statehood. It becomes, and as Öcalan sees already in the 1990s, an impossibility. So he begins really kind of thinking about what can self-determination mean. And I think that's a really important thing, because we have to think about the ways in which the anti-colonial movement, in its achievement of self-determination, understood as independent nation statehood, ends up creating a set of conditions which are not emancipation for the vast majority of people living in these conditions of economic and sub-imperialist dependency. And so that's, I think, a very important lesson that we need to be thinking about. And at the same time that, again, I put onto the table the global scale of the crisis of climate catastrophe, and the global scale of the crisis of the weapons of mass destruction, and the ongoing permanent wars between the major capitalist powers, or the tensions between the major capitalist powers and the ongoing wars around the world, is something that means that the solution to our problems has to be somehow sought both below the nation state, insofar as democratic empowerment of people, not having freedom given to people from the state, but people seizing from the state the democratic power, collective power on the one hand, and to the extent that we need some kind of collective decision-making bodies at the higher scopes, that we need to have radical reinforcement of transnational mechanisms of democratization. So a radical democratization of the global governing institutions, I would say. So we need to have more democracy below the nation state and more democracy beyond the nation state, in order to have any chance of surviving the 21st century, in the 21st century, surviving, much less achieving the long delayed, long deferred promise of human emancipation.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, because to go back to what you said at the beginning about Öcalan's questioning and then delinking of self-determination from the achievement of a nation state, it raises this question then of what it really means, the content of the concept, even what we're even referring to, let alone the means or pathways for achieving it. And in a basic sense, it's this issue of freedom, the ability to determine one's environment, one's future, one's development as a collective, as the self, whoever the self is. And the issue and the issue that Öcalan asks, and I think it's not a coincidence that this question is coming from the Kurdish experience, being divided across 4 nation states as opposed to just being encompassed within one or something like this, is has the nation state, say we have this experience of being divided through Lausanne, through imperialism, has the nation state increased our ability to do this, to determine our own future? And is no. And so it really opens up that question again. And I absolutely agree with you that the question is one of scale, below the nation state, above the nation state.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely agree with that formulation, that if we think about what self-determination can and must mean, self-determination has to mean power to determine the forces that determine our collective existence. And that power to self-determine is something that needs to operate at the local level, in terms of people having robust political participation, robust in collective experiences, collective projects, and it has to be coordinated transnationally. And the nation state, both through its centralization of power, it takes away the ability of people to self-determine at the local level, and paradoxically, through the decentralization vis-a-vis the coordinated, cohesive capitalist powers, it also is not of sufficient scope to deal with the problem of capitalist tyranny, the problem, much less the problem of climate catastrophe.
Or as we're seeing now with public health.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I think that this question of the scope of democracy is something that by articulating self-determination in a way that decouples it from the aspiration for nation statehood, he opens up, reinvigorates a deeper understanding of self-determination, which is very much linked to the core of democratic ideals, and less linked. It still is not unlinked to questions of ethnicity, because the domination of one ethnicity over another ethnicity is fundamentally undemocratic. And so in that respect, self-determination requires some sort of recognition and accommodation and toleration of multiple ethnicities. But very importantly, by delinking the aspiration for nation statehood, he also manages to overcome what is a kind of dialectic of majority versus minority, a negative dialectic of majority versus minority, where something, you either have a state or you don't have a state, and there's a nation with a state and there's a nation without a state. If we can move towards a democratic nation, understand that kind of articulation of a democratic nation articulated against the state, you can have articulation of ethnic freedom, multi-ethnic, multilinguistic, multi-religious accommodation in a free society. So to speak. So that dimension is not absent his rearticulation. And I think that's a really important variation on the theme of democracy understood, radical democracy against the state, how he articulates it. If you compare it, for example, to Bookchin's articulation, where Bookchin has very little to say about ethnicity. Obviously, thinking through the Kurdish question, you're going to be thinking about this fundamental problem, which I think is a model for an alternative, not only in the Middle East, but the so-called Middle East, but around the globe. Certainly, if you think about the situation in Israel-Palestine, I think that something like the democratic and federal model, the no-state solution, is ultimately going to be the way forward.
Absolutely,
it has to be.
Absolutely, and I think this gets at why self-determination, understood through the opening up afforded by Öcalan's questioning, resides or occupies such a central position, because if it concerns the ability of peoples from the local, regional, continental, global to how to structure themselves, how to organize themselves, and how to live alongside one another, both horizontally and vertically at these different scales, and bringing in the question of the individual as well, how to have a free life for individuals, this question of the possible tension between the individual and the collective, and how that's mediated. It sits at the center of these questions of how to reorganize, how to restructure.
Yeah.
The central issue in some respect.
Yeah, the central issue. So very good articulation. I'll let you have the last word on that.
Well, my last word would be a question. So
okay, you have another question for me?
I do. How you think the work with peace in Kurdistan and the Kurdish movement in Europe relates to this issue, the struggle for self-determination at the global level?
Well, I think that the way in which peace in Kurdistan works is, I think, an embodiment of democratic and federal ideals. Just if we talk about the way that Estella has cultivated my own activism in the movement, and the way that she has worked with you as well, with so many people, with respect to like these delegations. What these delegations do in the first instance is they give people an experience to witness something, and then there is a set of ethical, moral questions that are raised, like, okay, now you've witnessed this, what are you going to do about it? And so always trying to make connections between people who are coming from different places, to get people involved in the struggle, and to see the struggle as operating on multiple dimensions, but incorporating people into a kind of more active approach. So the Kurdish movement generally, I'd say, operates in this direction. So with Dilar, for example, inviting me to go to the north of Syria, in a way, she was asking me. She's saying, I know you're this Marxist professor, but let's see what are you gonna, what do you want to do about the situation of the people that I'm struggling with? So there's a kind of invitation, which is at the same time a challenge with respect to what is to be done, the question of what is to be done. And Estella is always asking that question of people. Peace in Kurdistan is always pushing for that, and always trying to make connections to other movements. So it's Peace in Kurdistan, I think, is very influential with respect to the campaign against criminalization of communities, for example, CAMPAC, always trying to think about ways in which we can make connections to people who are rooted in different struggles, rooted in different places, and coming together around mobilizing for the freedom of Abdullah Ocalan, and around the paradigm of the Kurdish freedom movement with its articulation of self-determination, I think, is precisely, it's not an accident that I spend my time working with Peace in Kurdistan and not for Jeremy Corbyn. So,
absolutely. The issue for me is contained very well in the title of the book, is Your Freedom and Mine, and the ability to really experience the process of coming to really recognize that there is a shared foundation of the struggle, that it's not about solidarity in the sense of me being a detached person and then coming to help you. It's that your struggle is mine in a very deep sense, because we are conditioned by the same forces, by the same world at this scale. And that requires overcoming, I think, a lot of tendencies that we have, that especially in this part of the world, we are conditioned into, to sever different aspects of our life, of the personal and our professional, the political, whatever else, and to really understand and see how they're integrated and act from this position. This is how I understood what you said about the challenge of, okay, well then what do you do with this insight, with this knowledge?
Very much so.
All right. Do you have any final comment you'd like to leave us with?
No, I mean, I think it's a enjoyable conversation, at least for myself. I hope some other people find it, at least in some respects, illuminating. And I look forward to continuing the conversation and continuing to work with you, Connor, but also with Peace in Kurdistan, and Stella, obviously, in
Mhm.
particular.
As do I, very much so. Thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure and an honor.
All right. Thank you.
All right.